So today I'm going to talk about the juicy stuff, suspension. In this video I will be going through what every setting does, how to set up the bike for your riding style, and how to test and develop your own setups. I'm going to start off by going over some words that are good to know and what every setting does, and then move on to what settings to change and stuff like that. I hopefully remember to add timestamps so that you can jump around in the video and come back to parts that you want to rewatch. First, before we start, if you want some free setups, I have a few in my Discord server, which is linked in the description. And it is good to keep in mind that although you will have a good understanding on how to set up your bike and what settings to change after watching this video, you're still going to have to put in the time in testing to kind of gain the experience to be able to make good setups. So let's start off with some words that is good to know, and the first one is going to be the stroke of the suspension, and that is basically just the distance that the rear shock can compress. Second is the sag, and that is how much the suspension compresses when the bike is just standing still. And then you have static sag, where it's just the weight of the bike, and you have the raised sag, which is when the rider sits on top of the bike. So next, let's look at what everything does, and you can read about all this in the OEM manual. I will link that in the description, and you have like a short explanation of what everything is, but I thought I might as well just go through it in the video as well. So first of all, the spring is basically the stiffness of the spring in itself in the suspension, and that is going to affect the overall stiffness of like the whole suspension, right? IRL, we use it to get the right sag for your rider weight. In game we can use it a little bit differently, mostly to like just make the suspension stiffer. Then we have preload, and that is kind of how much load is put on the suspension when it's standing still. And this is often changed together with the spring. It's mainly to just adjust the sag of the bike. And you can actually check the sag of the bike through the setup menu. Compression is going to be how fast the suspension compresses. So if you hit a bump, the compression is how fast the suspension goes up when you hit the bump, right? So going more clicks will make the compression faster, and we often say that we make it softer. In reality, the thing we actually change with the clickers on the compression is how fast the suspension goes up, but if the compression is faster, it usually feels softer, so that's why we sometimes call it softer as well. On the rear shock, we have slow and fast compression, and this is not how fast the bike is moving, it's just how fast the shock is compressing. So the slow compression is going to be like the slow smooth loads like braking and acceleration, while fast compression is, for example, in the mid to end of whoops where the rear shock compresses fast, right? And same here, more clicks will make the fast compression faster. Rebound is how fast the suspension extends back out after it's being compressed, and having more clicks will make the rebound faster, so it extends back out faster. Then we have oil, and this is how much oil you have in the forks. So if you have less oil, it's going to make the fork stiffer at the very end of the stroke. While having more oil, it's going to be softer at the end of the stroke, but it's going to bottom out easier. And moving on to geometry, we have fork offset. This is going to bring the forks further away or closer to the frame, which will affect the stability and the turning of the bike. Then we have fork height, and this is going to change the height of the front by moving the forks up or down in the triple clamps. This is measured with how much the forks stick up from the triple clamps. So a higher number will actually make the front end lower. Then we have swing arm length, and this adjusts how far back the rear tire will be. So going with a higher number means that the rear tire will be further back, which will make the bike longer, and going with a lower number moves the tire more forward, making the bike shorter and more agile. And the rod length will adjust how linear or progressive the shock will be in the stroke. So decreasing the rod length will make the stroke more linear, and increasing it will make it more progressive. And when you're changing this, you need to keep an eye on the sag and adjust that if needed. So how do we set the bike up? Well, there's a few things to think about. The first one is turning, and with turning, it's all about finding the balance between stability and the ability to turn. Having a shorter bike will make it easier to turn, and having a longer bike will make the bike more stable, but it won't turn as tight. And this you can adjust with the swing arm length and the fork offset. Another way to adjust the bike's ability to turn is to change the height of the front. Having a lower front will make the bike turn tighter, while having a higher front makes the bike more stable. Having the front too low, however, could make it easy to oversteer and potentially easier to front tuck, especially with the weird Piboso physics. And having the front end too high will make the bike want to go very straight. The clickers could also affect the turning, but not as much as the geometry. But going softer on the forks would make it easier to push the forks down, and having a slower rebound to the fork could help with the front end staying down. Next we have the ability to handle bumps and roughness. The bike's ability to handle bumps are mostly adjusted by the clickers on the forks and the rear shock. This is to fine-tune how the suspension itself reacts to bumps. It is very good to keep in mind your sag when you're adjusting the suspension, and the main things that changes the sag is the spring and preload, and you're mostly only going to mess with the sag on the rear. You don't really mess with it too much in the front, but from what I know, 70 to 75 mm sag, race sag in the front and 100 to 110 mm rear sag. It could vary between the bikes, you just Google if you're unsure. And it's not the biggest of deals, like you don't have to be like perfect with it because it's a game and there's some weird physics. But basically what the sag is supposed to do is that it makes your suspension work in the correct place in the stroke. And if you have the sag right, it's more likely that your suspension is going to feel good and work well. The main things you're going to adjust to change how the bike handles bumps is going to be the compression and rebound. And depending on how you set each of them up and how the relation between them are, the bike is going to react differently to when you are going over the bumps. A faster compression will make the suspension move up quicker on each bump, making it feel softer because the suspension is soaking up more of the impact. And the opposite goes if you make the compression slower. If you go with a fast rebound, you will feel that the suspension is pushing down more into the ground, and that it might extend back out a little bit on the bumps themselves, which could make it feel a little bit more bouncy. If you on the other hand go with a slower rebound, the suspension won't extend back out as fast, which makes it feel like the suspension is soaking up the bumps more, and it's going to be less responsive to the bumps. If you go too slow on the rebound, however, the suspension might start to pack up, and then it could start feeling a lot harsher. The suspension will also stay down a lot more, so having a slow rebound in the rear will make the bike feel lower in the back during, for example, accelerations. So if you like a bike that's lower in the rear, you could go with the slower rebound, but if you go too slow, it's going to be a little bit slippery side to side. So what's the best way to set up compression and rebound? Well, the most important is to have a good balance that is designed for your riding style and your preferences. I would say there are some general guidelines though. If you are a more aggressive rider and you often slam into things, you want to go with a stiffer suspension to be able to handle the big impacts, while a smoother rider could go for a softer suspension. Now, if you are a smoother rider, it doesn't mean you have to go with a softer suspension. It just means that your riding style allows for a softer suspension. As for rebound, going with a faster rebound will make the suspension react more to the bumps, and this could actually be helpful, for example if you want to jump on the bumps like a Jet Lawrence, while having a slow rebound will make the suspension feel more dead and less responsive, and this means that you will actually feel the bumps less. Most of the time you want to move the rebound and suspension clickers the same way, so you get a stiff but less responsive suspension, or a soft but more reactive suspension. Or you could have both at a very neutral balance point. At the end of the day, it's personal preference. You just have to be a little bit more careful because going too far in one direction will come with its negatives and positives. And if you go too far, the negatives will become really big. So you need a suspension that is balanced to work all over the track. For Supercross, it is more important to have a good setup compared to outdoors, and we want a stiffer suspension to be able to handle the big bumps and the whoops. There are two main things to set your suspension up for, and that is the whoops and the corners. The tricky thing is that it requires a lot more technique to ride Supercross, so you also have to be extra careful to feel if it's the setup or a skill issue, right? Going to a higher spring rate is a good way to make the suspension stiffer. If you want, you can also adjust the preload to find the right sag. In the corners, we can get away with having the bike feeling more stable, since we only have the bowl corners on the track, and that's the only thing we want to set up the bike to be able to handle. As for the whoops, we want to go faster on the quick compression in the rear, since this is what is mainly going to be used in like the mid to end of the whoops. And if we have a faster compression, the bike is going to swallow up the whoops a lot better. But we also want to make the rebound a lot faster, so that the suspension returns fast enough out, like extends out fast enough before the next whoop, because otherwise we will run out of suspension, and if you don't have any suspension in the whoops, you're basically fucked. So how do we test the suspension? The most important skill while testing is to understand what every setting does, and more importantly, how it affects the handling of the bike. This will mainly come from experience, but also from watching videos about it like you're doing right now. Or just reading about it also, but watch my videos. A good way to learn what everything does is to adjust one setting at a time, and we often do 2 clicks at a time, and then going on track and testing, trying to feel the difference from the setting we changed. There are some settings where we only want to go 1 click, and that is fork offset, because that makes a big difference for each click. You could also go all the way to one side on the clickers for a setting, and then go all the way to the other side and kind of testing out the difference, just to like really exaggerate the change, to really try to see what the setting does, right? It could also be really good to go back and forward with the changes, so changing it 2 clicks and then going back and testing back and forward like that. The way I usually go about it is I find a good pre-made setup that I'm comfortable with, then I go to a track that I'm familiar with, that I can run consistently, and I run 1 or 2 laps with the current setup, and then I try to feel on which part of the track I'm uncomfortable with or dislike. For example, it could be a certain corners, or like corners in general, like maybe braking bumps. Once I know in what scenarios I'm uncomfortable, I try to think of why I don't like the suspension and how it works in that scenario, right? It could be like the bike is oversteering, it's understeering, maybe it's kicking a little bit in the back. Then I try to figure out what I should change to make the bike better. If the bike is oversteering, I maybe want to make it longer or higher in the front. It is also tricky because changing the compression and the rebound of the bike could also affect how the bike handles in the corners a little bit. So if you get it good in the bumps, it might start to feel worse in the corners. So it is all about finding the balance, and that will come with a lot of testing and experience, and you will never be 100% with your setup. I would say the goal is to find a good baseline that you're really comfortable on, that you can go fast on every kind of track, and then just make adjustments for each specific track if you want to or need to. And sometimes you set the bike up so that it works really well in the areas where you are good, so you can go really fast there. And some people, or sometimes, you might want to set the bike up to work well in the areas where you're bad, to go a little bit faster in those areas, while going a little bit slower in the areas where you are already good. So that's also something to think about, and that is mostly personal preference, how you like to set it up. It's also good to try a lot of different setups. When you're starting out, try a bunch of free ones from different people and see which you like and what you like about them. You might like how one setup turns and maybe how another setup handles the bumps. Then you can take the geometry from one and the suspension clickers from the other one and kind of combine into a new setup. And then from there on, you can start to tweak it to your liking. I have a few free setups for the main bikes in my Discord server, so if you want to try them, join my Discord server, which is linked in the description. We also need to adjust the suspension for different track conditions. For sand tracks, you want the bike a little bit higher in the front to help it get on top of the bumps and the rollers. To do this, I like to go 2 to 3 clicks higher in the forks, so going to a lower number, and go 1 to 2 clicks slower on the rebound in the rear. This makes the front higher and the rear stay down a little bit more. If there is a lot of choppy bumps close to each other, like Southwick, you could also go 1/4 to 1/2 a turn faster on the quick compression. just to make the bike a little bit softer in those kinds of conditions. But if you do this, you might have to adjust your rebound as well, but that's something you have to feel out and learn with experience. More than sand, every other track is going to be soft soil, so the traction will be the same on every other track, although you might want to adjust the suspension to work for the scaling or other characteristics of each individual track. So that's all for this video. I hopefully remember to put in timestamps so that you can easily go back and rewatch whatever part you want to watch again. Also, if you have any questions or want help with setups, feel free to leave a comment or just ask me in my Discord server, which is linked in the description.